Thessalonians. We're going to be in chapter 4, verses 9 through 12. And really this series has been a continuation of Easter. The book of Thessalonians was written to this church, and it has an intention of like, what does it look like to live between the resurrection of Jesus and the return of Jesus? And actually a lot of that comes to light in this passage where the people were living in such a way that they just thought, some thought Jesus had already returned, like he was already back, or is he going to return very soon? So they were just kind of like sitting back and relaxing, like, hey, it's all going away anyway, and Jesus is going to return, so we're not going to do anything. And the Apostle Paul writes to encourage them to live the Christian life, to live a life of following Jesus in the everyday. In our passage today, it says that we'll look at, it says to aspire to live quietly. And one of the things that we started talking about last week in this section, there's a turn in the book in chapter 4 where it talks, kind of moves from the essence of the gospel to the essence of the good life, the implications of the gospel. And it says one of the shortcomings of the church is that we proclaim the good news of Jesus, which is what we're supposed to do, what we're all about, but we fail to teach the implications of the gospel. We'll preach the good news and the essence of the good news, but we don't preach the essence of the good life. And what does it look like to follow Jesus in the everyday? We teach about believing the gospel, but we don't do as good a job at what does it look like to live and adorn it, to be wrapped and clothed in the righteousness of Christ. And what the Apostle Paul does, and you see this as a pattern in his books, he'll teach doctrine kind of on the front half, and then implications or outworkings of the doctrine in the second half. And that's what the shift we see in chapter 4. In chapter 4, he starts with 3 occupations, which John Stott that says that humanity is preoccupied with. And last week we talked about sex and sexuality. And if you live in our world, if you live in our culture, we know we are preoccupied with sex and sexuality. This week we are going to talk about work and vocation. It's something that's centered to everybody's life. And then next week we're going to talk about death and what happens when you die. That's the questions that they have. And so if you're here today, we say, like, hey, what do the scriptures teach? How do we understand these areas? In chapter 5, there's this one verse that kind of wraps those 3 areas of sex and work and death into one. In 1 Corinthians 5:14, it says, "And we urge you, brothers," it says, "to admonish the idle, to encourage the faint-hearted, and to help the weak, and to be patient with them all." Many tie this to what we see at the beginning of chapter 4, encouragement to help the weak, help those who have struggled with sexual self-control. They're weak. Help them to have self-control. It says to encourage the faint-hearted, to encourage those who are bereaved, those who are going through loss and death, those who are struggling. They need encouragement. And then what our passage today will drive at, there's a call to admonish the idle. Admonish the idle, those that have an unwillingness to work. Stott put it this way. He says, Paul moves on in this section from chastity to charity, from the control of sex to the importance of work, from the need to help the weak to the need to warn those who are idle. There's a thrust into vocation, into work, and to what you're doing with your time. And we need to ask if the Apostle Paul, if he's teaching this church about something, we can always ask the question of why. He's writing to a particular place in a particular time that have particular challenges. And what we want to show is, yes, we have those same particular challenges and those particular struggles, but there was a particular reason he was writing them this. And some say, well, he's encouraged them to admonish the idle because there was a scarcity of work. But that wouldn't be it. He was warning and calling against idleness, of an unwillingness to work, not being unable to work. There's a difference between being unwilling to work and not able to work. And so some are not able to work. And this sermon could count as condemnation towards you. That's not what he's writing about. He's actually writing them to work, to provide for themselves, to help to provide with those who can't provide for themselves, those that can't work. There are people, and that's what the Christian church was known for, is caring for people that can't care for themselves. And so he's not talking about people who are unable to work. He's talking about people who are unwilling to work. And there's a few factors why they would be unwilling to work. And one I mentioned is some thought there was an imminent return of Jesus. In fact, some of the teachers, the false teachers, were saying that Jesus had already returned, that the new heavens and new earth were already complete and here. And there's this underlying thought, and we still have it here, is what happens here doesn't matter. Jesus is going to come back, so what happens here doesn't matter. Actually, our kids came home from school last week. We had this week, and we had a conversation with one of our kids, and like, oh, it doesn't matter. We're all just going to go up to heaven. Some teaching that this earth is going to turn to hell, and we're like, no, like, let's work on our theology. And so we had to go over, like, no, this heaven, this earth matters. What you do here matters. It's lasting not just for now, but for eternity. We have different views of end times, and everybody's welcome to be a part of this church. It's a secondary issue, but my theological back says, like, no, Jesus is going to come and return this earth. He's going to make this earth new. And so what we do here matters. It's not that Jesus is going to return, so who cares? No, Jesus is going to return, so the kingdom has come. The kingdom is coming. We have purpose now. So we still have that posture like, hey, Christ is going to come, or none of this matters, but it does. Some were teaching that it was more spiritual to preach. And so don't worry about manual labor or hard labor. If you're really spiritual, if you're a real Christian, then you need to be a pastor. Then you need to be a missionary. Then you need to go do something else. Actually, this was a struggle for me. I had a mentor who was he's written books. He's like a sales coach. He's a corporate sales manager, and he was a huge mentor for me because I was in sales, and this is what he struggled with me. He goes, Brian, you're going to go into ministry, but sometimes the ministry takes the best of what we have. And no one's saying I'm the best, but he's saying, like, hey, you have a job. It's not more spiritual to become a pastor. And actually, it was the opposite for me. I wanted to become a pastor because I knew what people went through with their vocation, what people go through with their work, the challenges of having bosses and having coworkers and losing your job. It was actually a motivator. I valued work so much, I wanted to be a pastor to help people better understand that your work matters. But there was a teaching that it was more spiritual to preach, and that's just not biblical. There was another thing that was going on during this time, and it was called patronage. And there would have been patrons and clients. And Paul is writing and warning against this. He's warning against the less wealthy in the church they were becoming dependent on the patron, the wealthier in the church. There's a good warning for every church. You can't be dependent on just those who have a lot. Everybody needs to contribute. Everybody needs to work. But there was people during this time, they were called clients, and they would have patrons. And the patrons would use the clients to get their agenda done. And then the clients would use the patrons to provide for them. Does that make sense? So Paul's warning that, hey, that's not biblical. That's not Christian. And underneath all of this was a culture that had a disdain for manual labor. The Greeks had a disdain for manual labor. We're going to hear from a philosopher today, but there was part of that culture, part of that context, that it was all intellectual. You wanted to discuss ideas and talk, and if you did manual labor, if you worked with your hands, you were looked down upon. And again, this is a very real thing in our culture. What's the goal of America? To retire, right? People set up their life like, how quick can I retire? How quick can I not work anymore? Right? There's some retired folks here that I am grateful for. I'm going to talk to you about how what you do it matters. But underneath, we live in a culture that what? I want to stop working as quick as possible. I'm going to go do nothing. We live in a culture that looks down on manual labor. We were driving through McDonald's the other day, and couldn't be in the house for a while, so I was driving through with the kids, and they saw a sign that you can make $11 to $13 an hour, and they were like, "Dad, that's a lot of money." And I'm like, "Well, to you, yes, but when you're trying to support a family, no." But there's people that there's another reason why you're ordering from a computer, right? Because nobody wants to do what? That job. We were buying the McFlurries, and they were like $4 a piece, and I was like, "Hey, do you got like a snack size?" And she's like, "No." And I was like, "I'm not sure if we're getting McFlurries anymore." She's like, "Yeah, I got kids. Like, we don't buy McFlurries. We go to the store and we buy ice cream, and we bring it home. We make our own McFlurries." I was like, "That's the Sullivan route. We're going there next time. We'll take the McFlurries this time. Until you come back with a snack size, we're not back." Right? But there is a disdain. There's whatever your views, and there's different things. We were having a conversation last Sunday night on immigration. But one of the problems that you see that I've talked to Chris about, that I've talked to people in our church about, is there's nobody people to work in the restaurants. There's nobody that wants to work in landscaping. There's a disdain for manual labor. And we can deride and say all this stuff about immigration, which you hear a lot of. Part of it is there's people that want to do the work. There's a disdain for manual labor there and now. But as we talked about with sexuality, that Jesus comes in and his teaching was revolutionary. His teacher was counter to what was going on in the culture, in the world. And what this passage does, like he did with sexuality, he shows the implications of the gospel and the significance of work. That work matters, that it's important. My hope today is that we'll get a broader view of work. That it's not just something that you do to get a paycheck. That we have a broader view of work, and my hope is that it just triggers something for you. So I'm going to cover a lot of different areas, not very deep. Does that make sense? And so for me, I hope it triggers for you, hey, what does it look like for me to work in light of who Jesus is? To maybe grab something and say like, hey, what does that look like in my life? We need a broader definition of work. And it's not just what you get paid for. And it's not just something you do so you can do something else. This is also big in our culture. Hey, I work so I can what? Go out on my boat. I work so I can play golf. I work so I can go to the beach. Work is just a means to what? Real life. But what the scriptures say, you're like, no. We're created to work. Work is part of life. We need a broader view of what work actually is. There's a helpful sermon. He did this whole series, so you guys are going to be hearing some influence of Tim Keller, who's a pastor who just pastored New York. But on this passage, he quoted novelist Dorothy Sayers. She has a book, I believe it's called Why Work? And in it, she defines work as the gracious expression of creative energy in the service of others. Again, we need a broader definition of what work is and what that entails. A gracious expression of creative energy in the service of others. So work is a gracious expression. Work is gracious. It's a gift from God. It expresses who we are as people made in the image of God. It's creative energy. We live in a world, in a culture that consumes. True life is to consume. Your kids may have been home for a day or two already. What do they want to do? Consume. Consume YouTube videos, consume video games, consume whatever. Right? It's all made to make them think that's life. We were created to create. And the last piece we see, it's in the service of others. We work for the good of others. That's why so many people don't want to work. Like, what's in this for me? This is boring. What do I get out of it? We're not connecting it to a greater cause. Work is a gracious expression of creative energy in the service of others. So what that allows, so I can go back to it real quick, is it allows it, that's more than what you do for your paycheck. I talked about retirement, right? You may not be getting a paycheck anymore. But I love our friends David and Martha are back. He retired from a vocation, and guess what they did? They were missionaries, right? That's work. They went and did something. Larry, I was at a 8 a.m. Thursday morning meeting with Larry, who is retired, still working, semi-retired, using extra time to do what? Serve the church, lead the church, pray for the church. You're still doing something. Many of you are grandparents here. You have creative energy in the service of others. You help with your kids. You help with your grandkids. Love talking to Frank. They had a new granddaughter boy. They're like, hey, moving down here. We're going to figure it out. You're moving in with us for a while. Right? Love seeing it. I love we have people who are either retired or semi-retired who aren't just sitting back doing nothing. We couldn't function as a family without BB. We don't do any of it. I do some of it. We don't do it as well. Right? You need to see how what you do is a gift from God that we use for the service of others. And it's really interesting, and I'm going to read it now, that he sticks this, a passage on the love for others in between a view of sex and a view of work. And Mark Howell, in his commentary called Exalting Jesus in 1 Thessalonians, it says, this passage gives us a genuine love for others is reflected by how you live and work. How you live and work reveals a genuine love for others. And just as you can take advantage of others in sex, you can take advantage of others by a lack of work, by in idleness. And we see this in the middle of it. Let me read it, verses 9 to 12. He's talking about don't have sexual immorality. And then let me read verse 9 to 12. He says, now concerning brotherly love, you have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. So he's talking about sexual immorality. Then he's talking about, hey, you need to love one another. You need to have brotherly love. He says, for that is indeed what you are doing to all the brothers throughout Macedonia. But he says, but we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more. So verses 9 and 10, which we'll dive into, he talks about this love for one another. And then it says, and to aspire to live quietly, and to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. And so he had this love for one another that was given by God, but they needed to continue into it. And he's encouraging them to love one another. One of the reasons he had to encourage them to love one another and put an emphasis on it, because the church was the only place that people from every background, every ethnicity, every socioeconomic area came together. Everywhere else, everybody was separated. And so the church would come together, and there'd be rich, and there'd be poor, and there'd be young, and there'd be old, and there'd be those that are able to work, and you have those that are not able to work, and they would all come together, and then the people would look around, and you're like, you want me to love who? Because nowhere else in the culture and the society did you have to love people like that were different than you. And so that's why Paul admonishes them in the middle of it to work, to love one another. And he connects the love of your brother to work. Again, I'll read 9 and 10 again. He says, now concerning brotherly love, you have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. For that is indeed is what you are doing to all the brothers throughout Macedonia, but we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more. In that, what we see is that work is to be used for the good of others. Work is an avenue to love your brothers more and more. It's just one sentence in the Greek. There's no stopping there. He connects the love to one another to aspire to live quiet lives and to work with your hands. It just all runs together. Work is to be used for the good of others. The big idea you see in the Bible with work is that it's for the common good. We will never be satisfied in our jobs, whatever they do, or our vocation, or whatever we're called to in that season, until we tie it to something greater than ourselves. This is for the good of others. You have to connect what you do to the good of others. Right? So say you have a profession, you have a vocation, and you have the ability or you make the choice to hey, I'm going to hit pause on that, and I'm going to focus when they're little on raising my kids. Not everybody has that option. Not everybody has that choice. But say you do that, right? There's nobody patting you on the back at the end of the day. Hey, look, great job, right? There's no like performance review. You don't really see change for a really, really long time. You don't see something happen. I talk to Karina about this all the time. When she was in news, she would go in, they would do a show, and it was either a good show or a bad show. But you know how it went. You started a show, you ended a show, you produced something. You raise kids, you don't see anything. Right? In fact, you're like, hey, I think we're trying to do this the right way. In some ways, they seem to be getting a little worse. Right? You need something deeper to motivate you. This is an expression for the good of another. Look at Memorial Day. It's tomorrow. It's a celebration of those who sacrificed. Now, I'm not getting into like just war or pacifism or whatever your view on war is as a Christian. Again, secondary issue. You can have your own thoughts. You can have your own views, very biblical ones on either side. But if you look at the idea of a soldier, what motivates them? They sacrifice themselves literally for what? The good of others. Right? We're not doing this if somebody else isn't what? Sacrificing for that. It's for the common good. It's for something bigger than them. It's not what they get paid for, right? It's not good for family life, right? It leads to a lot of dysfunction. You need to tie your work to something greater, something that is for the good of others. And in another way, and this is underneath in this passage, in a provision sense as well. This is kind of what he's driving at with the whole passage. And working is a way of loving others because you're not dependent on anyone else. It's an actual act, an act of love. John Stott put it away. He said, work is an expression of love to support ourselves. It is an expression of love to support ourselves. Why? Because then nobody else has to support us if we are able. Again, let's go backwards. Some of us aren't able for whatever reason. No shame, there's no condemnation. Again, this passage is actually to like support yourself so we can help support people who can't support themselves. So work allows you to not to be dependent on others. But then on the flip side, it also allows you to provide not only for yourself, but for others as well. This church in Macedonia, in Thessalonica, was known for their generosity. They were known for not only working to provide for themselves, but working to provide for others. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, talking about this church would be included, it says, "We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia, for in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part." So they were impoverished, but they had a joy that overflowed into generosity. For they gave according to their means, they gave what they could, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord. They were generous with what they had, with what they earned. And it says in verse 4, I just kept going, it says, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. So they work to provide for themselves, which is biblical, and they work to what? Provide for those who are in need. It says, out of their poverty they were generous. It wasn't like, hey, I got a bunch right now because whatever, sales were up. It's like, no. In our poverty, we were generous. They fought for ways to give with what they had. So for us, we need to know work is to be used for the good of others. In a world that works to accumulate and keep everything for self, the revolution of Jesus works to provide for ourselves and for others. Again, it's revolutionary. It's counter to what's going on around us. In a world that works to consume and to keep, we work to, yes, provide, but also what? Be generous, to provide for others. He goes on. Verse 11, it says, and to aspire to live quietly. What this is driving at is there is a call to work and live from a position of acceptance versus for acceptance. He says, aspire to live quietly. One translation says, make it your ambition to live a quiet life. One commentator said, it's saying, strive hard to live quietly. He's saying, don't feel a need to draw attention to yourself. Have a quiet spirit, have a quiet heart. Again, this is countercultural. This is counter what's going on in the world. Mark Howell, again, in his commentary, said, in this generation, ambition is rarely directed at restfulness. Most often it is directed towards the restless pursuit of some goal, achievement, or status. When it says aspire to live quietly, he's saying work from rest. Have a contentment. He says, yet God's view of ambition is so different. Christians must make it their ambition to live in such a way that they project a quiet confidence in the God they serve. Look, we live in a world that says you need to work for some goal, for some achievement, or from status. There's an inner restlessness that you have, that I have, to achieve, to live up to some ambition, to live up to some goal. This past week, we were in this gym for, I don't even know what awards, end-of-year awards. That's what it was. And Crosspoint kids were well represented. It was awesome. It was super cool. I was a proud pastor. I was like, man, this is great. And it was good to even talk to some parents and people who are trying to live a certain way, to do certain things, who get mocked and ridiculed, to get some affirmation from their teachers and to get affirmation from their peers and to get affirmation for all their hard work. We're all well and good and should be celebrated. But there was a part of me that watched and seeing, man, there is a lot of pride that could be taken here, and there's a lot of pressure that's just going to increase. Because if you get an award in 5th grade, what do you want in 6th grade? If you get an award in 6th grade, what do you want in 9th grade? If you get an award in 9th grade, what do you want in 12th grade? An award. And what does it do? Pressure, pressure, pressure. It can also lead to pride. Look at me. I walked up there. So the next morning, pastor's kids, we had a conversation, because there was there was a lot of kids that got the same awards. And then there was also a lot of kids that got 0 awards. So what does that lead to? A lot of shame. Well, I guess I'm just a kid in the crowd. And some of you are like, hey, I don't even bring my kids to school on those days, right? They don't have to sit through that. But that leads to a life of what? Achievement and striving and pursuit and going after acceptance. That doesn't go away. Some of you, this is what drives your work. We're trying to achieve something. That's what drives my work. Think I want to call churches and people who have sacrificed and given and done everything hey, it just didn't work out. I wish it was oh yeah, I just do all of this because I'm holy and I love Jesus and I want other people to love Jesus, which is at the core of it. But ask her, I'm a competitive little sucker. We were playing volleyball in the pool yesterday, and Karina's like, who's winning? And she's like, let me guess. We'll let the kids win a pool volleyball with a plastic ball from the dollar store. Right? We live in a culture that is driven. But when we understand who Christ is, when we understand who God is, when we understand what he calls us to in work, we have a quietness. We can live a quiet life. We can live a content life. We can live a restful life. We don't have to strive. We don't have to achieve. We don't have to keep going. We live in a world where we work for status. We work to gain an identity. What's the number one question? What do you do? We make what you do who you are. It's pursuit of acceptance. We live in a world that grinds after an identity. And Jesus comes and says, rest. I'm belaboring this point because I think it's the most significant. I think it's the most important. Our communion song will be called a song that says, slow me down. That's the battle of our world. That's the battle of our culture. To slow me down. Let me have rest. And that's what Jesus offers. In a restless world, we have to ask, what allows you to live quietly? In a restless world, what allows you to live quietly it's that you're working from acceptance as opposed to working for acceptance. You're working from acceptance, you're accepted, you're loved, you're a son and daughter of God. You have all the status you'll ever need. You're accepted. And we'll talk about it. You move out into the world out of acceptance. You don't start with working for acceptance. It's everywhere. It's one of the reasons I fit in here. It's a driven culture. Next thing we see on work. Work frees you from meddling. Work frees you from meddling. Look at 11b. And to aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs. Mind your own business. The meddling is an intrusion or unwarranted interference. In 2 Corinthians, he dives into this one. I won't spend as much time here, but he dives further in this idleness and why it was a real problem in the church and in the community. And it says, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. It's 2 Corinthians 3. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. Again, what does he say? Not willing. He doesn't say not able, okay? I'm going to keep hammering that point home. Let him not eat. For we hear that some among you walk in idleness, not busy at work, but what? Busybodies. Now such persons we command and encourage in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work quietly and to earn their own living. There were people who had the ability to work and they were choosing not to. And what happened? Sort of messing with everybody else, meddling, causing problems. Stott put it this way. He says, because they were not busy with their own business, they had become busybodies, meddling in other people's matters. There's no nice way to put this. We live in an outrage culture. Everybody is mad and outraged about what? Everything. I was on a trip with Will. We stopped at a whatever Fairfield Inn or whatever it was. I woke up and he's 14, so I was like, let's let him sleep in and I'll go work on some sermon stuff. And I was just sitting there trying to nicely work on my sermon and read the Bible a little bit. And there was a 24-hour news channel on. It doesn't matter which one because they're all the same. And this guy was just screaming. I'm like, dude, it's like 7 a.m. How are you this mad already? And he's like, your blood should be boiling. You should be so angry. I'm like, dude, what? About what? And it was about something I had nothing to do with. Like, I can't do anything about that. It's not my business. There is, what they found in social media is that people stay on social media longer when they're angry versus than when they're happy. Like, there's algorithms for this. There's people that study. Brandon isn't like an expert in this stuff. So if I butcher it, talk to Brandon. He'll correct me. You stay on longer when you're mad. Remember, it used to be a like button. Now what do we have? Angry button. Right? What are we doing? We're getting into stuff that's not us. That has nothing to do with our community. That we can do nothing about. That we can't control. In a world of outrage, the revolution of Jesus compels us to work for the common good. You know what we should do instead of getting outraged about what's wrong with the world? Find what's wrong with the world and go make it better. Right? We need to watch less of the 24-hour news cycles. We need to scroll through our phones less. Because why? Can't do anything. But we can walk across our street. We can go to places in our community where there's what? Real need. Where there's real brokenness. Well, I love staring at Frank. Semi-retired, retired, very busy. Helping with grandkids, on the city council. He was a mayor, right? So does Frank like politics? Yes. But what does he do? He does something about it. He's not just outraged about everything. He engages in it. I have some of my best conversations about if there's brokenness in this world, like what's a good fix? What can we actually do? Some of us need to get busy. Another thing we see with work is that we were created to create. We were created to work. Look at verse 11. Part C, it says, to live quietly, to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands, as we instructed you to do. He says to work with your hands. God made us to create. Again, we live in a what? A consumer culture. Think about everything that everybody is trying to get you to do. It's something we talk about with our kids. Let's find something to do that we don't have to pay for it, that we don't have to buy something. Right? Why? Because everyone wants you to buy something and go pay to do something. We live in a culture that's meant to be consumed, but that's not how we were created. We were created to create. And in a world that viewed work and creating as degrading, Paul is showing that we were created to create. God is the what? Creator. He created everything. He's a God that does what? Read through the book of Genesis. He takes disorder, chaos, darkness, and what? Brings order and light and flourishing. We're made in the image of God. We're made to work. We're made to create. Work with your hands. Each of us has specific gifts. You were created in a certain way. You guys are up here creating what? Music. Notice where they put me. Over there. Right? They help me be a part of it. They're gifted in that way. And it's important to understand that you were created to create and know how you were created. You need to ask these questions. How has God created you? What are your gifts? There was part of this, like to live a quiet life. There's part of it, it drives that. Keller kind of drew this out. And he talked about there's an inner disquiet in your heart that leads you to be a busybody because you're not doing what you were created to do. You're not doing what you are passionate about doing. You need to say, like, hey, how has God wired me? How has God created me? What are my gifts? What are my passions? I'm super excited to hear from Paul. He's going to talk a little bit about this. You need to stop and say, like, hey, where has God placed you? What are the needs around you? If you have certain abilities, then what are the opportunities around you that you could be for the good of others? Where is their work needed? In this place. We live in South Florida. Even I set a meeting up this week. We are about church planting. We're planting churches over the place. I texted the other Acts 29 South Florida pastors. I was like, hey, can we get together? I was like, I want to talk about what does it look like to plant churches here? How can we plant churches? Where are needs in South Florida that we can come alongside and be generous and plant churches that will help communities flourish? We want to be about that. Where has God placed you? What family has he placed you in? What neighborhood has he placed you in? What workplace has he placed you in for this season? And the last thing is, when has God placed you? There's a book, How to Inhabit Time, by Jamie Smith, and he talks about when you are. What season of life are you in? What's the brokenness of the world at this time? There are going to be seasons where you don't feel like you're doing what you're called to do, that you're most gifted in. Because it's great, like when your gifts meet the opportunities, and you're just like in your wheelhouse. Those things don't always line up. Some of you are not working in the areas of your passion. It was great. We had a fundraiser golf tournament for Brian Galvin with Impact City yesterday. I loved hearing him talk about his passions coming together. I have a passion for soccer. I was a college soccer player, college coach. I have a passion for soccer. And I have a passion for the gospel. I have a passion for kids to know that gospel, and all these collide, and I've given my life for this. Right? That's awesome to be celebrated. That's what we should try and figure out, but it doesn't always go that way. Again, I'll use Karina. She is a journalist. Being a journalist doesn't always go well with having a family. So she stepped away from that passion for a while, for a season. Now she does freelance stuff in journalism. She'll sit there and do, like, they'll give her 60-page scripts, like the night before, and then she'll go do an hour-long show just like that. Like, it's like nothing. I'm like, how do you do that? Right? But there's also things that, like, aren't, like, that easy for her, or that isn't her wheelhouse. But it's like, hey, this is a season that God has called me to. This is what I am going to do now. So we need to ask, how has God created you? Where has God placed you? When has God placed you? What season are you in? What does it look like in your season to have a gracious expression of creative energy in the service of others? Keller said it this way. He says, all work is valuable. There's this call to work with your hands. He said, God is a creator. He is creative. He brings order out of chaos. He said, to sweep the street or to preach a sermon is bringing order out of chaos. He used the example, he's in New York City. He's like, if somebody didn't sweep these streets every day, this place would be disgusting and nobody would be able to live here. What do people look down upon if you're a street sweeper, right? What's an important job? What has value? Being a street sweeper. Is bringing order out of chaos. Taking the material world God loves and made and making it orderly and making it livable and redeeming it. He said, therefore, to sweep the street and to preach a sermon are both valuable work to God. We need to see how we do what we do, and what we do is valuable and important and significant to God. You need to connect it to something more. Last thing on how we ought to work is we need to work to please God. Work to please God. This whole section started in verse 1. It says, finally then, brothers, we ask you and urge you in the Lord Jesus that you, as you receive from us, how you ought to walk and how you ought to please God. Now, and Keller's mentioned this, he's like, some of you can hear that, and you can say, like, that sounds terrible. How in the world am I ever going to work to please God? And if that's your reaction, it's because, and that sounds terrible, it's because you have a terrible view of God. When we have a view of God, that he is our creator who loves us, who we're sons and daughters of, who were completely accepted because of Jesus, the only response is to work to please him. If we believe that God is actually after our good, if he's after our joy, the only response is like, yeah, I want to work for him. I've had a lot of bosses in my days. I've had some really good ones, And I've had some really bad ones. I've had a lot that worked after status and achievement, and I was just a pawn in their thing. Actually, the last job I had in medical sales, it was the first time I felt like this guy's for me. He's like, I don't care about them. He's talking about the corporate office. He goes, I want you to do well. He goes, I'll fight with them all you need. And he was for me. He was a boss that was for me. God is for you. So working to please him is how we have flourishing and good work. If we have the right view of God, working to please God frees you. Keller put it this way. He says, if you know God loves you because of what Jesus has done, if you know God has embraced you because of his work, that you're in, that you're accepted because of what Jesus has done, not because of what you do or how good you work or what you achieved or what award you got, based on what Jesus has done, you're embraced, you're loved, you're accepted. He says, now when you move out into the world, you do the work you do for the sheer joy of pleasing your master and for the sheer joy of the work itself. Until you know you're not saved by our works, but you're saved by grace, everything you do is filled with self-interest. When you know you're embraced, you're loved, you're accepted by God, it allows you to work for his pleasure and the sheer joy of what he has done. Jesus said, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. In Christ, you're accepted. You're embraced by God through his work, through his death on it for our shortcomings, for his death for the ways that we don't work as we're supposed to work, for our pursuit of our own self-interest. Christ died for all that. He sacrificed himself. He gave his life for that. In Christ, you're accepted. You're already embraced by God. Your identity is in him. God is pleased with you. And so you can rest. You can rest. And when we work from a position of rest, it's out of joy. It's for the good of others. It brings flourishing. Work from a position of rest. Let's pray.